All right, good morning again, everyone, and welcome. My name is Hyacinth Armstrong Vaughn. I'm the coordinator of the Biodiversity and Protected Areas Management Program for the Caribbean, and I will be your facilitator this morning. I've asked, so for those of you now joining, please introduce yourselves in the chat, letting us know your name, your organization, and your country. So to get us started, for those of you not familiar with this forum, the Latin America and Caribbean Management Effectiveness Tracking Tool Support Network, we recently launched in April of 2022. And our aim is to provide a space or forum where users and practitioners from Latin America and the Caribbean can share experiences, their challenges and successes in the application of the Management Effectiveness Tracking Tool, or METT, for improving protected area management. We are hoping that through the network, we can provide access to expert technical support on METT implementation and capacity development on best practices for successful METT implementation, ways to follow up on METT, recommendations, or how to implement those recommendations. Before I move on, we do have simultaneous interpretation, so you can select Spanish or French to hear in your preferred language. We are hoping through the network to have at least 4 sessions this year, at least 4. We may have more depending on needs. So these are the 4 that we have proposed and potential timeframes starting with today. And for those of you who would like to join the network and have not been able to do so yet, or have not been able to do so, please look in the chat and we will place a link for you to have a sign up where you can sign up and join. We are on Facebook using the Caribbean Protected Areas Gateway Facebook page. So today's session will be, the format of today's session, I would say, is a series of 3 presentations, 3 focused presentations. And each of those presentations will be followed by a question and answer session. We are using the chat function today to facilitate the discussion because we don't have a dedicated Q&A section. So the chat will be used for us to channel any questions. So as the presentations are being made, please feel free to enter your questions in the chat and we will address them at the end of the presentation. The other option you will have is when the presentation ends, we will allow you to raise your hand and then you will be able to then unmute yourself and ask your question directly. As the presentations are going on, however, I will ask you to remain muted so that everyone can hear without any challenges. So I think I have a young person joining us, if that person can mute. Thank you. Okay, so we are looking at completing the detailed assessments within the Management Effectiveness Tracking Tool. But before we get into what those detailed assessments are, of which there are 4, threats, habitats, species, and values, we need to do at least one key aspect of work before we can get into any of these, and that is to identify what our values are. When we say values, we are looking for those elements, those areas where as to why your protected area was established. These values are needed to inform the detailed assessment of threats and the detailed condition of values. What do these values look like? They can fall into several categories. They can be natural values. So those that are looking at nature or biodiversity. So your priority habitats or ecosystems or threatened species. They can be social values. So they can be those that are supporting recreational use or have a social significance to local or regional or national communities. They can be cultural values, so those that are of significance to indigenous people, or have a historical or archaeological importance, or have access or represent access to resources of cultural importance, for example, medicinal plants. All the major values can be economic, and that would be income derived from tourism or recreational use, or those associated with sustainable use of resources, payment for ecosystem services. So what is necessary is looking for these values, and these values are usually represented in a management plan, or they may be in the original documentation that was used to establish your protected area. For the purposes of the tracking tool, once you have identified these values, you input that information onto the protected areas attributes page of the tool. In this area here, you have up to 5 slots to be able to, 5 rows to be able to input that information. And within the tool, and I'm referring to the METT4 tool, if you select this link, it will then take you to a location where you can get additional guidance on how to identify the main values. So once you have this information, you are now in a better place to be able to now do the detailed assessment of threats, species, habitats, and values. So I'm going to turn over now to my colleague, Jose Curo, who is going to lead us through the first review, which is looking at detailed assessment of threats. So I'm going to allow Jose to share his screen. So while Jose is sharing, I will just indicate that once we are finished with the review of the threats, you will be invited to ask your questions. As I said, you can also use the chat to start documenting those questions, and then we will follow through at the end. All right, so I will now turn over to Jose.
Thank you, Hyacinth, and good morning, everybody. Thank you for joining this first session of 2023 for the METT Support Network. As Hyacinth was explaining, we're going to talk about the detailed assessment of threats. And this is one of the spreadsheets contained in the METT4 file, and it takes you in depth into the assessment of the threats that are affecting the values that Hyacinth was just explaining. And as Hyacinth explained, this section of identifying the values is one of the first steps in the METT4, and it requires a very well thought out exercise of identifying these values with the best available information we may have. It's normally not a way that we start doing analysis or even sometimes management plans of the sites, but it's a very important step of identifying those values, probably through a participatory process where we do a brainstorm exercise, perhaps with our stakeholders and partners on why is this area important. It may be stated in the law or the legal instrument that created the site. It could be already stated in a well done, up-to-date management plan of the site. So that makes it very easy to transfer that information into the METT4. But it seems that it's not common to have that information in the previously mentioned instruments. So a participatory session may be required to agree on what those values are. Also, making an effort to make sure that we identify all the values that are important. In the brainstorm, for instance, you can identify, I don't know, 20, 25 values, cultural, natural, economic, social values. But you have to prioritize and make it a short list. I think it was 5 slots available in the METT4. I have seen prioritizations of up to 8, but no more. Otherwise, it becomes a list, and there is no clarity or priorities. So this decision that has to be involved is very important on identifying those values. Because as you will see now here in the spreadsheet on the detailed assessment of threats, it will take you to prioritize or focus the threats on the values, on the conservation values that are affected. And I have to clarify from the beginning that some threats affect more than one value. So it may be that in the list that you see here on the first column on the threat category, residential and commercial development within a protected area may be a group of issues that may be affecting more than one conservation value. So here, for instance, we have housing and settlement, commercial and industrial areas, tourism and recreation infrastructure as the main one within the protected area. And if this is something that is happening in your site, then you have to go into the third column, column C, and give a detailed description of how the housing and settlement or commercial and industrial areas or tourism and recreation infrastructure are affecting the site, the protected area, the area that you are studying with the METT4. So this detailed description helps to go in depth on what is actually happening to the area based on the previously mentioned threats. This description is important to base it on expert advice, but also empirical knowledge on how you came about to decide that that was a threat for the area. And the next column, column D, for each of these threats, you have to identify which conservation values are being affected. And this drop-down list that you don't see any names here will come from the previous list that Hyacinth showed in her presentation. So the names that you put there, the 5 slots that you completed with conservation values, they will show here and you will get to pick one or another, and they will stay here in the cell. Now, so far, so good. This is a way we do it in an order that makes sense. We are like deriving the situation of the threads. Now we have to go to the thread extent. And here in the cell, you see when you position the mouse, the cursor over the cell, it shows you text of what this means. The thread extent is concerned of how distributed or how widely distributed is the thread on the area where the conservation value exists. Let's make it more specific. If we have mangroves in our protected area, and we know where the mangrove is located, we have it in a map, and we have a thread of cutting down mangrove for two reasons. One, for tourism infrastructure or tourism housing, luxury housing normally, and service provision of services. And another one's threat would be perhaps burning of mangrove for charcoal. So you have these two threats. So how widespread are they in the protected area where the mangrove exists? Is it in the whole distribution, in the whole territory of the mangrove, or is it localized in certain points where the mangrove exists? That makes a difference because it will help you address the threat with different conservation actions. And this is something that will come up from the analysis and the discussion in your participatory session with stakeholders and partners. The next one is threat severity. And threat severity is how serious is this threat? Is it so serious that will destroy the conservation value or values? Or it will just slightly impair the values where they occur, where they exist in the protected area? How serious is it? Is it, for instance, I remember we used to have conversations on this issue of severity of, is it possible to turn back, to undo the construction of a road or highway inside or next to a protected area? Most likely not. It's not possible to change it or undo it, as opposed to a place where people start dumping garbage in the protected area. Is that something that you can undo easily? So the relativity of the impact of the threat is very important to assess it, because again, it will help determine, along with the extent and other information, to address through conservation actions. And that's probably as valuable as this exercise is, at the end of the day, the conservation action that you agree on implementing to solve the issues here are of utmost importance. However, I must clarify that there are threats that are with such a wide extent and so severe that sometimes it's not possible for the protected area to solve it, and a higher level of influence might be needed to do it. And although those are occasional situations that take place, we must be clear that sometimes the solution of the threats is beyond our control. But nevertheless, most likely, the threat is still within reach for us in the protected area, and there's some conservation action we can implement, and we can incorporate in our budgets, in our projects. We can reflect in our operational plans, annual plans, or management plans, or all of the above, so that the actions that we agree on are supported with budget, with staff time, with equipment, and are known by partners and the hierarchy of the protected area agency and so forth. So, and that is extremely important. Here, the source of information, like I mentioned before, we have to document where we're getting this information from. Do we meet, or do we invite to our participatory session experts on the topic and on the protected area? Did we review reports from other government agencies, from our own government agency, or NGOs, or World Bank, or United Nations, or IUCN, where they mention these situations and they describe these types of threats that we are considering. So we list here the sources of information. If we talk to experts, it's a good idea to collect their contact information, their names, and have it here as a reference. So if anybody wonders, how do you come to these conclusions on threats, particularly threats, extent, and severity? Oh, we consulted these people, we reviewed these reports, we looked at these journal articles related to the subject, and that's how we came about our decision. Besides the fact that you will be establishing some sort of commitment already in the next column, which is management response, and basically what I've been referring to as conservation action. And here's where we have assess the threat. In this case, it's only one line for one threat. And we have identified which values are affected. We have decided on the extent and the severity. We have identified the sources of information. Now we have to decide how or what is that we are going to do in the protected area, in the site, to address the threat based on what we know. And I keep insisting on a participatory session, because it's where you create alliances and joint efforts to address threats, particularly if they are a wide extent or high severity. It's important to have others helping us, besides the people managing the site, to address the threat. Very important. Here on the notes is where we explain any decisions that we made, what happened, any pending actions or information that we need that we couldn't find, that we haven't collected. For instance, we have to enhance our monitoring of mangroves inside the protected area, and who's causing problems to the mangroves. And we need to collect that information. So we have some pending activities here. They can go also as part of the management actions, but also here on the notes, these could be some notes on things that we need to remember about this threat and how it's affecting the protected area. This exercise is very important, and in the beginning, if you do it for the first time, it will be a bit slow, and that's fine. But if you look at the list of threat categories and threats, you have a few things to consider. And as you move along, it becomes more practical, more experienced, the group, and then the answers start coming a bit faster. You don't have to rush, it's not the idea. The idea is to be as comprehensive as possible and find the sources of information that you need and have in the room the people that you really need to answer the questions and to reach agreements is very important. This shouldn't be shouldn't come as a surprise, any of these decisions, to people involved in the protected area management. Particularly if you have some authorities that need to be informed, like local governments, for instance, that sometimes they feel like perhaps a bit left out, or sometimes they don't want to be involved, and that's the truth. But if you open the doors and you have a participatory session, it's possible to do it. I want to point out at this moment that these threats categories and threats, list of threats, are related to what we call a taxonomy of threats, developed originally by IUCN and improved on a version 2.0, I think, by the Foundation of Success or Conservation Success. And it's available online, and it's a document, and I just checked this morning, it's still available, and you can download it. There's a conservation taxonomy of threats, where you can find even more information on these categories here in the list, in case you need it. There might be even some additional threats or threat categories already available that have been developed, because this is a growing knowledge. As we practice on the ground, knowledge is returned to the documents that try to organize the knowledge and the experience at the same time. Now, I want to go over a little bit on the threat categories so that we can become somehow familiar with it, and the examples of threats on the next column. In your protected area, wherever you are located, maybe residential and commercial development within a protected area is not an easy. So, and that's okay, good for you. But you have to look at others, like agriculture and aquaculture within a protected area, including silviculture and mariculture. So you have use of timber on certain periods of time of the year or throughout the year, problems with narcotics or other illegal drugs, either growth or either transport. It has been documented recently in some publications that drug trafficking or drug routes take advantage of coastal marine protected areas as hiding places or refueling sites. And so it becomes an issue that you normally do not associate with protected areas. And it has nothing to do with logging or poaching or the traditional things we're used to. But these are things that we have to be aware of. Maybe, like I said earlier, maybe exceeds the capacity of the protected area to pretend that we're going to deal with drug trafficking or drug cultivation. But we have to know, we have to have it documented, and if it's within reach, we should have conservation actions addressed to deal with those problems. Most likely, a joint effort with other government agencies, particularly authorities, police or others. But there are, as you can see here, there are different types of threats that you might consider like livestock. That is also continues to be an issue in protected areas. Agriculture, marine and freshwater could also be another issue to address. In documenting this, particularly the threat extent and the threat severity may require different levels of information, or there may be different types of data and information that you can actually use. Where you identify gaps of information, you may need to address them through conservation action as well, enhancing monitoring or introducing monitoring, taking advantage of citizen science if you have the opportunity in your site to start collecting data that will, in a midterm or short term, address the gaps of information in some of these issues. Again, being thorough in this identification of threats and assessment of threats is very important, so that we can have the best conservation actions already identified. And if you don't have many threats in your site, well, celebrate. But if you have a diversity of threats, it will require a more comprehensive analysis, and will require a clear understanding from your part of the threat's extent and severity. Energy production and mining, and this is becoming, unfortunately, another problem for protected areas, where the extraction through mining of microminerals for electric cars, batteries, and for cell phones. Now that everybody wants to have a different one every year, I don't understand why, but seems to be a trend. And the construction of particularly batteries for electric cars is presenting pressure, a threat for sites that contain particular microminerals, like lithium particularly, and there are others associated. So there are big projects of mining, even submarine, deep in the ocean, mining to extract banks of these microminerals. And some of these sometimes are within protected areas. So it's an issue to address. Could be something as simple as extraction of building material, like from a quarry, that seems to be more evident and more present in some protected areas. Also, energy generation. Sometimes it could be hydropower dams. Sometimes it could be wind farms, where you see the towers there with the spans that move with the wind, and then they're just there present. Some people have studied impacts on birds and some other species. So there are some issues to consider on energy generation. Also, transportation and service corridors, like I said before, highways that sometimes are inside or next to protected areas, and these normally bring about some threats. Along with the road comes threats of developing businesses along the road, along the highway. Could be gas stations, convenience stores, restaurants, and so forth, as well as serving as illegal access to the protected area, and increase presence of threats, like poaching, extraction of timber, and so on. shipping lanes and canals as well. Like you can see some examples of this and next to the Panama Canal, or some sites where you have wetlands that the communication or transportation service provided through canals is very important. Biological resource use and harm is probably something that we might be more familiar with, like hunting, killing, collecting terrestrial animals, gathering terrestrial plants or plant products, logging, like I mentioned before, fishing, killing and harvesting native aquatic resources. These are some threats that we may already have in the protected area or are likely to become present. Human intrusions and disturbance, like recreational activities and tourism, which is always coming along with protected areas. War, civil unrest, and military exercises. Unfortunately, this keeps happening in the world. I hope not in your country or whatever you are. Research, education, and other activities sometimes can also represent threats to the protected areas, particularly in areas with more strict management categories. Activities of park authority, construction of vehicle use, artificial watering ponds and dams, visitor centers, and so on, that are promoted and built by the park authority or protected area authority. Vandalism, destructive activities, threats to protected area staff and visitors. This we have seen very common around the world, and there is an organization, the Rangers Federation, that keeps track of how many protected area rangers have been killed during the last years, and we are already in the thousands. So it's a real threat. More in one places than others, but it's still an issue. Impact from cultural and religious tourism may happen. Natural system modifications, here number 7, that deals with habitat clearing, fire and fire suppression, dams, hydrological modifications, and so on. And fire, just yesterday I was having a long conversation on fire management in protected areas for the Selva Maya in Mexico, Belize, and Guatemala, and how prevalent it's becoming along with climate change, and how demanding it is for protected area authorities in resources, and staff time, and equipment, and so on. Fragmentation, isolation of natural habitats is being addressed now in many parts of the world. I would say many parts of the world, with the strategies and conservation actions related to connectivity to maintain the connection of or in this case of forest cover and protected areas and so on. The invasive and other problematic species and genes is also a big problem in invasive non-native alien species, like fish, like we know in the Caribbean, and plants and weeds, like we see in wetlands. As long as animals that have been introduced recently or have been introduced hundreds of years ago, decades ago, and they are invasive and compete with the natural, the species that naturally exist in place. Now, pathogens, and this is also related to the whole issue of health now. After COVID, we are learning more about how to relate this issue from natural habitats in relation with humans. pollution entering or generated through sewage or urban wastewater, particularly where we have rivers, lakes, and coasts. This is a very important issue. And it's important in places where there's tourism activities, commercial activities, where you have to deal with restaurants, hotels, and so on, particularly important because of the volume they generate, let alone issues with industrial, mining, and military effluents and discharges that have to be considered and assessed. Garbage and solid wastes, airborne pollutants, and more. Now, geological events is something that happens and not necessarily could be controlled, like volcanoes, earthquakes, tsunamis, avalanches, and landslides. We have seen a lot of that in the world recently. And they just, put you in a position of being reactive of what can you do. You need to be prepared. It's called readiness that you need to have in your protected area. It's not conservation action that will prevent or stop a threat, but it provides you readiness on how to react and how to keep the staff safe and so on, and other people safe as well. Climate change and severe weather as well is not something you are going to change in your protected area, but you can have conservation action directed to adapting to the impact or overcoming some of the impacts of the climate change and severe weather. An increase that we have seen on cyclones, for instance, in the Caribbean, in other parts of the world, that seems to be increasing because of climate change. So how do we adapt and prepare for this so that we can reduce impacts, particularly in human lives and infrastructure and values? Cultural and social threats, loss of cultural links, traditional knowledge, management practices and use, natural deterioration of important cultural site values, sometimes even related to climate change. It's a new field, recent area of knowledge that people from culture are developing, learning about climate change and how that is affecting cultural site values of utmost importance, and how they want to adapt and react to that. Well, destruction of cultural heritage, loss of land tenure, particularly with indigenous groups and so on, and local people. Governance problems, conflicting policies that affect governance and decision-making, particularly local communities, indigenous groups, local in general, who makes decisions, confusion about government roles and so on. And then there's room for addressing others threats that I'm pretty sure will be very specific to some of the sites, but should not be left out. And like I said before, improving this taxonomy of threats, it's an ongoing process. And some of the things that are very specific to your site, wherever you are also important and should be eventually included in the taxonomy if they are not yet. And being able to document all these different columns and have sources of information and generate conservation action is extremely important for the site, for the assessment of the METT4, and you will see how this will be fitting into other of the spreadsheets contained in the tool. I will leave it at that, and I think Hyacinth said that there will be some room for questions if I'm not mistaken, so I'm here available. Thank you.
Thank you, Jose. So we do have one question in Espanol from Viviana Ramos Palacios. So she conociendo que cada área protegidas tiene su propia particularidad. Esta taxonomía de amenazas que no están mostrando puede ampliarse o ya está definido.
Gracias, Jason. Viviana, I'm going to answer it in English. Thank you for the question. Yes, like I said, you saw, well, at the bottom, you saw that there's room for 2 or 3 additional threads that you can add, but I think you can add more. I don't know how much you can change the spreadsheet, but regardless of the space in the spreadsheet, you can do your own Excel sheet and expand it. We have been requesting that the structure of the tool be open source. It is open, it is free, but tweaking and adapting the spreadsheets is not easy. They are protected. Probably in the interest of maintaining some consistency. But I know the authors, and I think it will eventually come an option where you can adapt the spreadsheet. So far, you cannot. So I would recommend to use the spaces at the end here of other, where you can add at least 2, and I'm pretty sure we can find a way to tweak some of those other categories to include more than 2. So that would be my answer so far. And as soon as we know that there's a free open version of the spreadsheets, I will let everybody know. Thank you.
Thanks, Jose. There is another question in Spanish. You want me to read it in Spanish, or you want? Like I did before. I can do it, it's no problem. So, este es como un METT en versión 4, porque la versión que tengo solo tiene 3 hojas de Excel. Descripción del área protegida, calificación de intensidad de la amenaza, evaluación METT en sí. Esta hoja de Excel de descripción de amenazas no está incluido en la versión que tengo. Muchas gracias. So Jose, this version that we have is the METT4. I'm not sure what version.
Yeah, it might be a previous version that he has. And the only thing I can do, well, get the version 4, and it's available online, and it's in Spanish. Our friends from WWF Ecuador made a big effort to have it translated from English into Spanish, and it's available in protectedplanet.net under themes, management effectiveness. There's a section there on METT. You can go there and get it in Spanish. If that's too complicated, let us know. We'll send it to you. That's probably faster. So yeah, there have been 4, maybe more versions of the METT, but the 4 is the most updated and more comprehensive is the one we're showing here. Thank you.
Thank you, Jose. Are there any other questions? I don't see any more in the chat. If not, we will move on to the next presentation, which will cover two topics, habitats and species, and my colleague Justin Springer will deliver these. So if you have any other questions related to threats, please put them in the chat. And I will turn over to Justin to walk us through the detailed assessment of habitats and species.
Okay, thank you, Hyacinth, and good morning to everyone. Allow me to share my screen. All right, so can everyone see my screen clearly?
It is visible, yes, and clear.
Right, so good morning, everyone. My name is Justin Springer, and I'm technical assistant on the BIOPAMA program. And today I will be exploring the detailed assessment of species and habitats. And first, we will be taking a look at defining what indicator species are, why choose indicator species, and then we'll be looking specifically at the 6 attributes in the table. This will be followed by the detailed assessment of habitats, where we will define habitats or ecosystems, however persons choose to define them. And then we will also look at completing the 6 attributes in the table. So the detailed assessment of species is a particular assessment that comes directly after question 36A in the METT4 assessment. It looks particularly at key indicator species that have been selected by the protected area management team for whatever reason. And while it does not necessarily add to the METT score, it is important in informing the status of these key indicator species. This particular assessment is linked to question 37, which looks at conservation status of key indicator species here. So it's important to note that when you select this particular question, it's only relevant for you if there is a particular identified species that you are using as indicator species, and if there's a particular monitoring program in place for these species. If this is not the particular case in your protected area, you can feel free to just select the box if you don't have any indicator species, or if there's not enough data to support this assessment. So the key question here is really, what are indicator species and why are they important? So we just take a look at indicator species and defining what they are. And generally, indicator species are those which are often quite sensitive to environmental change. They can signal a change in the biological condition of a particular ecosystem, and therefore may be used as a proxy to diagnose the health of an ecosystem. Also known as bioindicators or biological indicators, they're used for being able to tell how well the ecosystem is functioning or how well it's doing. If you look at some examples, there are some species of plants or lichens that are sensitive to heavy metals or acids in precipitation, and therefore their presence, their absence could be an indicator of air pollution. Also, there are other indicator species that reflect a unique set of environmental qualities or characteristics, and that are found in specific places which have a unique microclimate. If you take a look at other examples, in the case of amphibians, they're often used as bioindicators, especially frogs and toads, because they have permeable skin and they're quite sensitive to changes in water quality and pollution that may affect the water quality. So in certain cases, if you can assess the population of these species over time, they can be linked to other practices like pollution, which may affect the aquatic environment in which they live. Other species are also used as indicators, not necessarily of specific activities, but they may be indicative of overall ecosystem health, particularly in the case of marine protected areas. For example, if you look at the coral reef ecosystem, the long spine sea urchin or Diadema antillarium is a key stone species in that ecosystem, functioning as a grazer. And these species consume a lot of macroalgae, and in controlling the macroalgae populations on the reef, they also help to create space or substrate for coral species to reside and grow. So they are very important in helping to maintain that balance, that ecological balance on the reef. They're also prey species for other species like lobster, and in some cases triggerfish and other species. And therefore they have multiple functions on the reef system. Also, parrotfish are also used as indicator species because they are important grazers as well, helping to maintain algae on the reef. And they are also prey species for larger fish, may be snapper, grouper, or sharks. They are also used as an indicator of fishing pressure. In our region, particularly I'm located in Barbados, there is quite a taste for parrotfish, or what we call popfish, and therefore the numbers or the abundance of these species can be used or linked to fishing pressure, especially within protected areas. So depending on the presence or the abundance of the species, it can be linked to the amount of fishing pressure that's experienced within the area, which can then be linked to particular management actions like enforcement and surveillance. Another species are sharks. Sharks are very important apex predators, and they are also used as indicator species because usually within ecosystems, whether within the terrestrials or the marine space, apex predators are at a high trophic level and usually have multiple prey species, and therefore they rely on many prey species to survive. So therefore, usually having apex predators like sharks, you have a good gauge of how well the ecosystem is functioning because you have those different levels of prey at the lower levels in the ecosystem that the sharks can rely on. So these are just some examples of indicator species that are used across the world in different contexts. And it's not necessarily to focus on the specific species that are mentioned, but the key question is, why choose these species? What do they indicate? How is the presence, the absence, or the abundance of these particular species linked to specific environmental conditions? And another question would be really, how are these conditions linked to the overall ecosystem health? And how does that link to particular management activities? So let's say, for example, you may have a high abundance of a specific aquatic species that is linked to good water quality. And how this species changes or the abundance changes over time may be linked to improved watershed management practices. As we said before, a high abundance of a particular species, in the previous case, parrotfish, may indicate lower fishing pressure, which may be a result of greater levels of surveillance and enforcement within the protected area. However, these things must not be considered on their own because ecosystems are very complex. Marine protected areas, terrestrial protected areas, and their management is also a very complex thing to think about and to consider. And there's so many different variables that impact species presence and abundance. And therefore, choosing indicator species is a very technical process, and it must be accompanied by a thorough study of what is being indicated and what is being correlated, and how this species fits within the larger ecosystem. As I said before, the presence, absence, or abundance must be linked to some environmental condition in a scientifically sound manner. And therefore, this must be done to justify its use as a practitioner's proxy. It's important to note that judging an ecosystem just based off of one single indicator is like if you go to the doctor and he just takes your pulse, and after taking your pulse, he just prescribes a treatment without considering other important factors like your medical history, your blood type, your exposure, where you live, different conditions that might impact your health. And therefore, choosing particular indicator species must be a very scientific, rigorous process linked to particular environmental conditions. And it's a process that must also be linked to management actions and to a larger extent, the overall conservation objectives of the protected area. So what are we trying to achieve? What is the objective of this conservation? And therefore ensuring that in choosing these species, there's also enough capacity to put monitoring programs in place to collect data on this species that can then be used to analyze trends, which can then be linked to changes in environmental conditions, which can be linked to management processes. So we will have a look and examine an example here of a marine protected area where several species were chosen. And we are looking at the table now that's in the detailed assessment of species. And on the left in the first column, we have the key indicator species there listed, where we have this particular area chose the long spine black sea urchin because of their role as keystone grazers. They chose parrotfish, which were indicative of fishing pressure and their importance as grazers. They also chose grouper and snapper, which were also very important species on the reef. But these are also very commercially viable species that fishermen often target. And therefore, their presence and their absence and abundance could be indicative of fishing pressure within the space. You also have macroalgae and you have hard corals. Now, if we take a look at the table, we see that there are 6 different attributes which we will explore as we go on. These are the range, the population size, the reproduction, mortality, and age structure, the area of habitats, the habitat quality, and the extent of threats. It is key that when you're completing your table, you not only consider the species, but you observe trends in these different attributes over time. And usually it's recommended within the guidance to use a 5-year period before conducting the assessment, where you can have a good gauge of how these attributes may have changed over that period of time. So this is followed by reasons for rating. It's also important to place justifications for why you have chosen a particular variable. And then importantly, the ways to improve the conservation status of the species. So now we will take a look to explore in more detail the various attributes. So if we look at range, which is in the first column, the range basically is defined as the geographic area over which all individuals of that particular species can be found during its lifetime. And it includes all the various life processes. So whether in the juvenile stage or as an adult, whether the organism is feeding, it's sheltering, or is looking to reproduce, the range encompasses the geographic space that that species may travel within its lifetime. And the range may be influenced by multiple factors. It may shift due to conditions like habitat loss or climate change that impact the various habitats or ecosystems that that particular species may live within. So there are various levels that you can choose depending on how that range has changed for that particular species. In this particular example, we have 3 areas. As you can see, the long spine black sea urchin, the range was stable. The parrotfish, its range is increasing. And in the case of the macroalgae, the range decreased. It is important to note that these different variables may change over time, and they may vary according to the particular species that we're focusing on. But that's where we go back to the importance of having a link to strong, robust scientific data that whoever is doing the monitoring or the research or collecting the data is doing it in a consistent manner over this period of time, that correlations and trends can be identified to inform this particular variable that you choose. Secondly, we look at population size. So population size really looks at the number of individuals in a population at a given time. And this focuses on how the population size has changed over this time period, whether it's 5 years or not. Sometimes, depending on the particular species, you use different periods of time for collecting population size, and it's hard to attain a trend over a shorter period. Sometimes you need to have a longer period of time to collect and identify a particular trend. This obviously will be informed by your research and the methodologies that you use, and depends on the particular species. Usually population size is a variable for identifying the number of individuals, but how this is recorded, it may vary according to the particular species. So in science, you may use transects, quadrats, or mark recapture methods. In particular species, like the long spine black sea urchin, you may look at population density. So the number of individuals per area. In terms of fish, you may look at the biomass, where you look at the number of individuals, the size of the individuals, and then you create a biomass measurement. In terms of macroalgae or hard corals, you know, we look at the area of coverage over the reef per area. So depending on the particular species that you've chosen, you need to be able to identify the particular measurement that you will use and collect consistent data over that period to be able to collect or identify a particular trend, to identify whether it's increasing, decreasing, or if it's stable. Then we go to reproduction, mortality, and age structure. Now, this attribute mainly looks at the stability of the population as it relates to the reproduction rate, which is the number of births, compared to the mortality, which is the number of deaths, and then the age structure. Obviously, the number of births and the number of deaths and how they interplay with each other will impact the stability of how a population grows or how it declines. And therefore, in particular cases, depending on the species that you're assessing, understanding how the births and the deaths change over time will be able to give you a clear trend in if the population will increase, decrease, or how stable it will be. Obviously, for example, in some cases, if the number of deaths largely outweighs the number of births, you will see a decline in the population. and therefore it may be less stable and it may start to decline. Conversely, if you see a greater level of reproduction than death, you see an increase in that population. And in some cases, there may be more of a balance and the population levels off and is more stable or consistent over time. However that trend looks, that must be linked to a clear, robust scientific methodology of the population of whatever species you are assessing. The area of habitats. Now that particular area looks at the geographic coverage of the habitats of this particular species. So we spoke about range previously, and now we speak of habitat. So the range includes the geographic space that that particular organism travels or lives within its lifetime. Now, sometimes there's a confusion between range and habitats, but it's important to note that the species range of an organism may encompass various habitats. But as it relates to the habitats, we're speaking of the suitable habitats that that organism can live in specifically, and how that area has changed over time, right? Because the reality is that even though a range may encompass various habitats, so as a species may live in one area, it may reproduce in one area, however, it may migrate through another and just spend a very short space of time in that area, but that habitat is not necessarily suitable for that species to live and breathe. So it's important to be able to define the differences between the range and the habitats. Habitats being more the specific area where that species lives consistent. In terms of habitat quality just speaks of the suitable habitat that is there for a species. So let's say on a reef, you need a certain level of diversity of coral, you need structure, you need different elements that make that habitat suitable for other species to live, like your parrotfish or your snapper and then your sharks. So how has that habitat quality changed over a period of time? In this case, unfortunately, the quality is declining, but obviously this would be led by the particular methodology and the research that you're collecting over that period. The extent of threats. Now, Jose spoke about the threats earlier, and this particular variable must be linked to the assessment on threats that was presented for consistency. And threats are basically any factor that negatively impacts the species or its existence. And Jose would have listed several threats before, whether it's pollution, which leads to poor water quality, you have disease, or you may have encroachment and poaching, where persons are coming into the marine protected area and illegally fishing and reducing the fish stock. In the case of disease, there was an outbreak of disease on Black Sea urchins, I think in 1984, across the region, which impacted many species. A lot of Black Sea urchins died and disappeared. In the case of amphibians, there's a chytrid fungus that impacted a lot of amphibians across the region as well and across the world. So disease is a very real thing. Encroachment, poaching is a very real thing that must be factored in when you are also conducting these assessments. And that's why consistent monitoring to see how these threats change, how they impact the species, is important to be able to have a very robust response to this question. And finally, we look at the reasons for ratings. The reasons are very important because they provide a justification for why a particular answer is chosen in the assessment. It's fine to put an answer, but what is your rationale for that? This also must be linked particularly to the scientific research or the scientific data that has been collected, so that persons reading this assessment or following up on this assessment will know why have you chosen this, what's the particular reason, and then that will inform the particular ways that the conservation status can be improved. In this particular case, we have the need to improve water quality for improving the conservation status of the Black Sea urchin. In the case of parrotfish, improve water quality to stop illegal fishing in the park, increase enforcement, increase public education. Public education is coming out again. Enforcement is coming out again. And these are particular key things that then will go into informing the adaptive management that comes after you conduct your assessment. It's fine to do this assessment and look at it and say, we have this species, we know the status, but the question is, what will we do with the knowledge that we have? We've identified that it might be in decline, the population may be decreasing. What do we do going forward to improve management? So how do we need to adjust our daily work plan or our management plan to help treat this particular challenge? So if we see that there is a lower abundance of the parrotfish on the reef and you are aware of illegal fishing, is it a case where we need to improve or increase our level of surveillance? So do we need to, instead of having just 5 patrols, do we need to have 10? Do we need to have patrols during the day? Do we also need to have during the night, so 24/7? Do we need to put other measures in place to increase enforcement and surveillance? How then do we fund that? So right now, you may be cash-strapped. Do we need to seek further funding to support increased enforcement? And therefore, you see a ripple chain effect of connecting the dots, of identifying the challenges, the ways to improve, and then the actions that need to come after that. So we move on to the detailed assessment of habitats, which, very similar to the detailed assessment of species, is very relevant for understanding the habitats and the conservation habitats within the protected area. And we don't need to get caught up on the technical details. Some people refer to them as habitats, others may refer to them as ecosystems, which in the case of terrestrial protected area may be a forest, and the marine protected area may be your coral reef, or it might be your seagrass beds. You, as the protected area manager, will choose what is your habitats or ecosystems within your protected space and why you're choosing them as key habitats. Similarly, for the range, in this particular case, we have coral reef, mangrove, and beach were chosen. And this is in a marine protected area, the same area. And similarly, you have various variables. So whether it's decreasing, whether it's stable, or whether it's increasing, the range of the habitat will speak to the geographic area that that particular habitat covers. And obviously, this must be linked to scientific data that you've been collecting over time to show how that coverage has changed. Similarly, with habitat, that speaks of the area or geographic coverage for this particular habitat that you're focusing on, and how that coverage is changing over time. In the cases of coral reefs, You may do your coral reef mapping through your coral reef surveys. In the case of mangroves, persons may do remote sensing or aerial image analysis, and then mapping the geographic coverage of the mangrove and how that changes over time. Whatever methodology you use, that must be consistent there over that period to be able to identify a specific trend. Structure and function. Now, structure and function can be broken down into different variables. When you look at habitat or ecosystem, the structure really speaks to the abiotic components and the biotic components. So the abiotic components being things like environmental conditions. So your water temperature, your quality, your pH, the level of sunlight that's coming in, all these different factors that influence the biotic components of the ecosystem. You have your coral reef as an example in the water environment, in the marine space. You have your biotic components where you have your autotrophs, you have your algae, you have your coral that photosynthesize. Then you have your other components like your consumers. So you have your grazers, like you have the parrotfish. Then you have the other consumers, like the predators now. So you have your snapper, your grouper, your apex predators like your sharks. When you look at the structure of the ecosystem, it encompasses all of these various factors, both abiotic and biotic. And how well the ecosystem is structured will impact how well it functions as it relates to the energy flow within that ecosystem. So how is the food chain functioning? Is it effective? Do you have various organisms in place to help facilitate that energy flow through the ecosystem? So all of this, as before, is very much supported by the methodologies and the research that's conducted by your scientists or your monitoring team or whoever is doing research of your space to give you a clear idea of how well your particular habitat is structured and how well it's functioning. In this particular case, it's declining, but there are also other variables that can be chosen, whether it's improving, declining, whether it's stable, depending on the condition of the structure and the function. Extent of threats. So this, similar to the detailed assessment of species, this is linked to the detailed assessment of threats and how they have changed over time. And we spoke about several threats before. In the case of the coral reef, you can have many threats that are faced, whether it's water pollution from land-based sources where you may have, farmers that might be using a lot of pesticides or fertilizers. As these make their way through the watershed, through the drain to the marine space, what you find often than not is you have an influx of these chemicals into the marine protected area, which then causes an increase in nutrients, which causes eutrophication, which causes massive algal growth, which can dominate the reef and cause a challenge for coral reef growth, and a decrease in water quality. You can have, for example, for mangroves, encroachment. So persons, as Jose would have identified, may be cutting the mangroves or clearing the mangroves for whatever reason, destroying the habitat. So the threats listed here should be linked to the detailed assessment of threats for consistency across your assessment. Reasons, similarly as before, there must be reasons that are provided for the ratings that you've chosen. and then ways to improve must be provided to inform actions following the assessment. So how do we improve? Should we limit the threats? How do we limit the threats? Do we do more public education, making people aware of the importance of the mangroves, what role they play in coastline preservation, or as nurseries for species of fish that they rely on commercially? And then policy, should we improve policies to enforce the laws that are used or support the laws that are used to maintain these ecosystems? So very similarly, it's important to have clear reasons for your ratings and clear ways to improve that will inform management actions. So that is all for the detailed assessments. Are there any questions?
Thanks, Justin. Yes, so there are 2 questions that were in the chat. They are in Spanish. The first one, so if you're not, I'll read it in Spanish. You can answer in English, but I suggest you switch to the English channel for interpretation. So the first one is from Javier Marquez, and he wants to know qué especies de flora o fungi u otros que no sea fauna que sean indicadores de salud del ecosistema pueden recomendar.
Okay, I would have to ask for the translation of that, maybe.
Oh, you didn't. Oh,
No.
so basically, what species of flora, fauna, or any others that are not fauna, that are indicators of ecosystem health that you can recommend?
Okay, so just to be sure, what species of flora and fauna, so plants or animals that
No, flora or fungi.
Or fungi.
Or anything that is not fauna, basically.
Flora,
that
fungi.
can be indicators of ecosystem health. Do you know of any that you can recommend?
Right now, no, I do not know of any. I would probably have to research that in more detail, but the key question is, because I can research it and we could check the various species that indicate environmental health, but I think the key question is, and I touched on this at the end, what is relevant for your protected area or your protected space? What exists within that space that you can then link to environmental health and link to a management action? So I think at the protected area level, the manager has to be aware, whether it is through the scientific research authority or the monitoring team, through conducting your biodiversity assessments, what are the range of species that we have within this space, and then being able to identify the specific characteristics of that species, and then how we can link that to particular environmental variables, whether it's air pollution or water pollution or whatever. That requires the manager to do a lot of research into that detail and then be able to hone in on, okay, well, this is what we want to monitor and this is why we use this particular species. But if it helps, I could do some research, and I'd encourage you to also do some research into what species of fungi that could be used as indicators, and maybe we could do some follow-up in the Facebook group and place some links to relevant documents or research of species that have been used as indicators.
Thanks. Jose, you have your hand raised. You wanted to add something here?
Yeah, just quickly, like Justin said, it would be dependent on the site, right? Which ecosystems are contained, which species, and I would just suggest to look into at the flora and fungi, to look into endangered species, threatened species, endemic species, or habitats that may be contained in a protected area as an initial list of values of concern that probably will have some kind of immediate need of protection. That could probably generate a snowball to narrow down other specific species and habitats may be developed over time in a more precise list. But I think the application of the METT4 is not once and that's it. No, it's a periodic application, yearly or biannual, etc., that will require, as knowledge is developed, that it will be developing more knowledge and more precision on the conservation values, on the targets, and the threats, and so on. So I think we should start somewhere, and that's a way to start. Now, specific names of plants and fungi, it will be so dependent on each site that if Justin will be able to do some research there of publications and so on, should get in touch with a person, Javier, I think, who asked the question. Thank you.
Thanks, Jose. Justin, there was another question from Nadezhda. Jose did provide an answer in the chat, but I will pose it anyway, just in case you wanted to add anything. So Nadezhda was looking for, I guess, whether given, so how could it be considered in the METT4 analysis if to date species and ecosystems have been identified as conservation elements, but there are still no studies that can define them as indicator species. So there's no monitoring of the species in the protected area. The monitoring protocols are still being completed, but not necessarily without the indicator species according to the criteria presented in the session.
So the question really speaks to, okay, so they're trying to identify or monitor the status of these species, but
Yeah,
there's
so
not a management.
Mm-hmm.
How can you monitor?
How can you apply
status?
this within the METT4 if you don't have it in place yet, I guess, or it's being put in place?
Well, that was one of the notes within the presentation. The importance of this section is it is not mandatory to fill it or complete it. I think this section or this assessment should only be filled if there's adequate data to support it. So in the case of their protected area, if the reality is, yes, you may have identified species that are important, they have conservation value, but you don't have a monitoring program in place yet for whatever reason, it does not make sense trying to complete this section if you don't have the appropriate data as yet. What you can do is, yes, I think in implementing measures or putting things in place to set up a monitoring program will help. So whether that's making connections with a university or research organization, getting donor funding to support monitoring, and then saying, okay, well, we will monitor these particular species over this period of time. It will be funded by this, and we link these species to particular factors, whether it's environmental variables. And then at the end of this period, we are going to do this METT on a 5-year cycle. We can then have data that will inform this METT assessment. That is something you can plan for. But it doesn't make sense to try to complete this section if you don't have the data for it, because what happens is sometimes And we've seen this as well in our assessments. Persons try to complete this section. They don't have the data from the scientific authorities, and it's incomplete and it's not consistent. And you can't necessarily gain particular key actions from the information that you have. So I think it's important to yes, identify the species, but have a plan in place to monitor them properly.
All right, thank you. So I hope that answers your question, Nadezhda, and I know Jose also provided a response. So I'm mindful of time. We have one more to just have a look at, which is the assessment of the value themselves. So I am going to walk us through that one. So similar to the habitats and species detailed assessment, the assessment of the values should only be completed if there is sufficient data available to determine the condition and the trend in those values. If the assessment does not contribute to the overall score when you do the management effectiveness assessment, but it can confirm or inform the rating that you do get when you review the indicator that is looking at the condition of values. And that is question 35 of the METT4 tool. In completing the detailed assessment, you are looking at completing a specific table that is available. And that table is pre-populated with the values from the protected areas attributes page. So my very first intervention in this session showed you where you would put those main values. And so those main values are automatically populating the table that is in the detailed assessment of values. So this is what the table looks like without anything in it. And what you will be looking at is once you have the values identified, you will now be looking to assess the condition and the trend. But how do we do this? You need to be considering and reviewing any available monitoring results and taking into consideration the knowledge of researchers, managers, community members, and anyone else that is involved in reaching a consensus on understanding what the condition and trend in values is. If you don't have any information to be able to complete this table, then that's fine. You can still look at assessing the condition of values in the regular assessment and give a rating based on whatever knowledge is available at that point in time as you're doing the assessment. So let's have a look at the condition. And what is the condition that we're looking at for any given value? We're describing basically the state of that value. And ideally, it will be determined based on the collective expertise of assessors. There's a scale that you can use to describe the condition, and you have 5 options. If the condition is very good, it means that the value is essentially unimpaired. From the time you established your protected area and you identified this value, if you're doing your assessment 2 years on and you're coming back to it, and nothing has changed in the value in terms of deterioration, then you can determine it as very good in condition. Or it can be good. And this is where there's some change to a small degree in the value, but it can still be maintained in its current condition. without any management interventions. If you deem your value to be fair, then it is moderately impaired. Now, these scales of small, moderate, or large will depend on your situation, and I think you'll have to come to some kind of consensus with all stakeholders as to what your definition of small versus moderate versus very serious is. But a fair value a fair condition would be one where the value is moderately impaired and there is need for some type of intervention to improve or have the value return to its original state or provide some time for recovery, depending on what the value is. If you deem the value to be poor, you're saying that it is substantially impaired and will require some type of intervention, some type of management intervention to recover. And then, of course, if you have no information at all on the condition of the value, then you can indicate that and say you don't know. So those are the 5 options that you have available to assess the condition of any of the values that you have identified. The other element that you are looking at is the trend. And what does the trend look at? Basically, how has that value changed since the protected area was first designated? And similar to conditions, you have a scale that you can use to describe the trend. Those 4 elements are improving. So is the is the value improving? Is it getting better or is it recovering? Is it stable, meaning it hasn't changed, it's staying about the same as when the value was first identified in the protected area and when it was set up? Is it deteriorating, getting worse? Or again, if you have no information, then you don't know. So you have 4 categories that you can use to determine the trend of your value. So you have identified the condition, you've identified the trend. Again, in keeping with the same methodology in the species and habitat assessment, you also need to justify and say why you have given these ratings that you have given. So under the justification for rating, you will provide the reason for saying that the condition in this case, you don't know what the condition of the ecological processes are, and you don't know what the trend is because you have insufficient data. So that is your reason. Similarly, for landscape and connectivity values, there's no information. So they've indicated there has been extensive land use changes over time, but again, there's no basis for them to determine how the value has improved or not, or changed. So you will do that for each of your values. You will define why you gave the rating that you gave for condition and trend. And then what is also important is to identify, where possible, how these values, at least the condition and the trend of these values, can be changed or improved. These are the management suggestions that will hopefully influence and support the overall direction in which you would go when it comes to putting in place the required management elements to improve the overall condition of your values. So in the case of the ecological processes in this example, they had insufficient data. So what is their way to improve? Identify how they can collect that data. And it may be setting up a monitoring plan seeking funding to put in place a monitoring plan that may already be in existence, but just not implemented. So the condition, the detailed assessment of values is one that also needs to be completed where possible, because at the end of the day, when you conduct your management effectiveness assessment, you are basically determining how well our management processes impacting these very values that your site was created for in the first place. So if you have no information on how these values are doing, then, and you're conducting a management effectiveness assessment, then one of the things that you should be considering is, what do we need to be putting in place as a recommendation for determining and tracking the values, the condition, and the trend, so that when we come around to do another assessment 1 year, 2 years, 3 or 5 years later, we are in a better position to actually determine our management processes and operational processes really doing and achieving what we are set up for, which is the management and governance of these values. So that's pretty much what I wanted to present on the assessment of values. But again, we've gone through 4 detailed assessments that are elements of the management effectiveness tracking tool. Depending on your state in terms of where you are with using management effectiveness and using this tool, we have worked with sites which, this was the first time they were doing it, so they completing these 4 assessments, they did not have sufficient information to properly do them. But in doing the assessment, they have started to create a foundation that can be built upon in subsequent assessments. In the case of sites where you have had these types of assessments done before, then it is very useful to be able to see where those changes are occurring, and again, know where your weak points are and where your strengths are and what you need to be adding into your work plans or your operational plans for improving overall management and governance. So I don't know if there are any questions on this or any of the other previous presentations that we gave. We have about 10 minutes left in this session. So are there any questions? Any more questions on what we have presented? If not, are there any general comments on what we have presented? I guess I will throw out a question, and please feel free. I'll give maybe a minute or two for persons to raise their hand and respond. Has this session been of use? Has this been useful for you? What we have presented on these 4 detailed assessments. Okay, I see Jean with his hand raised, so please go ahead. You should be able to unmute, I believe.
Yes, good morning, everyone. I apologize. I arrived a little bit late, but again, this is all incredibly interesting and useful for all of the processes that we go through. And I don't know if I missed it at the beginning, but just wondering if there was a numerical value similar to previous METs that we've used, which can provide us with a quick, very quick figure, I guess, like from 1 to 30 or whatever, to know whether or not there is overall an overall betterment of the situation that we're trying to examine.
All right, so let me see if I understand. So what we have gone through in this session are the detailed assessments, and the detailed assessments for threats, species, habitats, and values are then used to respond to questions. So in the case of values, it's question 35, and I could probably reshare my screen to see what that question is. But in that question is where you would then rate if you are, where you are in your management process for overall monitoring and management of that condition. And then out of that is where then you will see the total scores across the entire assessment. So I don't know if I'm answering your question, Jean, but in terms of these detailed assessments, you're not going to get a numerical value. What they are is preparing you to be able to then better respond to the indicator questions in the overall MET, which is where you will then score how you're doing with the condition of values or with managing the species or the habitat and threats.
Okay, I'll take a look. It sounds good. Thank you.
Yeah.
I think, may I add a piece to
go
that?
ahead. Mm-hmm.
Thank you, Jean. I think you should also look at the dashboard of the METT4, where it summarizes the results. It is helpful, and it's a short version illustrated of showing the results and how you're doing, and also allows you to use that information to compare with previous assessments. So it's an interesting way to see a summary of the results. Just wanted to add that piece. Thank you.
Okay, got it. Thank you, Jose.
Thanks, Jose. So I'll just do quickly share screen so you understand what we're talking about, and for those who are not familiar. So this is the METT4 tool. And so we went through in detail these different detailed assessments that then each respond to this, in the case of values, this particular question. In the case of species, this is where you will assess your indicator species. At the beginning, which is where Jose is recommending looking at the dashboard. So once you've completed the assessment, you'll get a summary table with the scores for each indicator question. But then you will also be able to see here represented the results graphically as a spider chart, as a bar chart, and then you can also see here when it's completed where you fit in on the different elements of the framework, how well you're doing. So the METT4 allows you to see, hopefully in a real time, where your strengths and weaknesses are with this summary. So I did provide a link in the chat for those of you who have not yet been able to access it. You can access this on the Protected Planet site. And our network is set up so that you are able to get more information. And what we would really like is to have a dialogue and, use that network for sharing experiences and so on. So I invite you to also join as well. I will repost those within the chat so they are readily available for everyone, because not everyone will see the chat, the earlier parts of the chat if you joined late. All right, any other questions or comments? No?
There's a
Okay.
question. There's a question in the chat, Hyacinth, in Spanish, from Karina Escalante. She said that when the indicative questions, there are actions that are proposed to improve the management, and then they are placed in one of the spreadsheets after question 38. Which is the structure that has sort of the action plan that summarizes the next steps or conservation actions of the METT4. And then she's asking, these actions must be proposed how? Long-term, mid-term, for the next time that the METT tool is applied, so that you can see an improvement. So I think that it depends on I would suggest that it's depending on the planning cycle of the protected area of the site. Those are sites that use annual operational plans, can project actions for a yearly basis that can be easily traced annually with the METT4. And also with the implementation of the annual operational plan. Places that do not have that instrument as a regular planning tool can use the management plan for that. Now, the combination of actions will be for different periods of time, depending on the threats, depending on the conservation values that you have. Some may be midterm, some may be long-term, some be short-term, perhaps. So it will be depending on what you put in the spreadsheet and probably the agreement that you build in your participatory session with partners and stakeholders on how and when to address this. After question 38, in the METT4. The spreadsheet there speaks about the current score of this. Let's say if you have, this would be your second assessment of METT4. You have the actual score for this session, the new one, the previous score, that's the one before, if you have it, the actions to improve management, and then you have to say when they have to be accomplished, who has to do it, who else needs to be engaged, what budget needs you have, and other comments. So this is this spreadsheet is the one I call like an action plan. And there, when you complete it by when, you have to reach an agreement with whoever you have to, or whoever you have in the room making decisions at the moment of the assessment, when we want to see this completed. And it will depend on your capacity, on your resources, and so on. So that would be my recommendation. I don't know if Justin, Hyacinth, you want to add anything else?
No, that's fine with me. I don't have anything else to add to that, but I don't know if that answers the question that was posed, if that was useful.
I think Karina put here gracias, so okay. I will assume that she's content.
All right. Okay, Jose, do you have anything else you want to wrap up with? We're actually 1 minute over, but
yes, quickly. First of all, thank you for joining us this first session, and I think there is interest to continue with the further sessions we have scheduled for the year. Please look at these detailed assessments as something complementary that is important in the overall implementation of the METT4. And normally when I have seen assessments, people do not complete this part. Because there's always a complaint that it requires more information, I don't have it. And then it might be true for the first iteration of the assessment of the implementation of METT4, but do not make it a habit. Do something about it, developing, it doesn't have to be perfect information in the initial iterations, but you should start building up the culture of doing monitoring, collecting data, reviewing publications, and especially engaging expert advice on the detailed assessment of habitat, species, threats, and values. You will see that over time, it's very helpful for your planning and for your overall management of the protected area. And look at it, incorporate it into the whole tool of the METT4 and how useful it makes it. With your stakeholders and partners, when they look at this on the screen in a participatory session, and then they revisit this a year later or 2 years later, depending on your periodicity of application, they will be extremely happy to see continuity, as well as your staff. I mean, the staff of the protected area will be very happy to see continuity in the implementation of something that is useful and makes sense. There might be questions that will arise after this session. Please send them via the Facebook of the network, and we will be our best effort to answer them, so provide sources of information for you to read or review. And the idea is also to start building up interest on future sessions on top of the ones we already have for next year or during, even maybe during this year. Which other topics of the METT4 you think are necessary to go in depth, so that we can help you, the network can help you improve your implementation. There might be case studies already being implemented on the issues that you are facing, and we will make our best effort to bring them along on future sessions so that we can learn all together from those cases. Any innovations and best practices and so on. This is the learning we want to promote through the network. And that will be it for me. Thank you very much again, and looking forward to have you in future sessions of the network. Thank you.
Thank you, Jose. And with that, I will say thank you very much for enduring the time with us. We really hope it has been useful. I reposted within the chat where you can access the METT4 tool online, as well as how you can join us in our Facebook group. So please feel free to connect. The recording of this session, along with the presentations, will be made available primarily through our BIOPAMA website, but we will provide those links to you through the Facebook page. And I think to connect to this session, you would have had to register. So we will also have your email addresses. So once again, thank you so much for your time and for your interest. And we look forward to engaging with you again in the near future. So please feel free to contact us through the Facebook page, share your thoughts, share your experiences, share your needs for additional training, and we will try our best to see how we can make this network one that is very useful for our region. So thanks again, everyone. Wishing you all a good rest of the day. Tienes un buen día. Adiós.